All right, here we are at the end of the World War II unit, almost. This is the second to last class that you'll have for the second to last lesson that you'll have for the World War II unit. Today we're going to see how the war comes to an end in the Pacific, namely against Japan. The last few weeks, so again, just as a quick recap, where have we been? We saw World War II, right? We saw how the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, began to invade nations in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And then we saw how the Allied nations, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, along with their allies, defeated Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in Europe. We saw Mussolini get arrested by Italian resistance fighters, be executed and then shot, and then had his body hung up in the center of Milan where all the Italians could go and, see his body, maybe as a warning against fascism. Maybe they, took the revenge on him. It's really gross what happened there. Physically gross, like looking at the pictures. It's not good. And we also saw what happened to Hitler, right? Hitler kills himself. Seeing the Soviets, the Red Army was getting closer to his bunker. He decided to take a cyanide pill. So that was the end of World War II in Europe. But even though the fighting had ended in Europe, the war in the Pacific, right? World War II in what we call the Pacific theater was still raging and would continue to rage on for a couple of months. Today, we're going to see how that fighting comes to an end in the Pacific. By the end of today's lesson, then, you'll be able to see how mostly American forces push Japan into a retreat. There will be some Australian forces in the Pacific, especially at the beginning. But really, the big thrust, the big effort, the big lift is being done by Americans in the Pacific. And this is we're going to see how they ultimately destroy the Japanese fleet. The Japanese Navy is almost completely destroyed in the Pacific, and they haven't really quite bounced back from that even today. We'll also see the rationales for the use of the atomic bombs. Maybe some of you already know about the bombs that were dropped on Japan. 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, one in Nagasaki. We're going to see maybe what the justifications were, what the rationales were. And then in later class, I'm going to have you, answer that question. Like, was it justified? Hearing the arguments, are you convinced? Should we have done that? And then 3, you'll be able to tell me what happens during the Japanese surrender. Or actually, what you'll actually be able to see is the actual footage of the end of World War II when Japan signs that surrender. So let's take these in turn. Let's first look at how American forces begin that final push to end World War II in the Pacific. The biggest naval battle in history, we think, took place in World War II. I say we think because there may have been some Roman battles with more ships or more people, but this is the one that we have the evidence for. Up to 200,000 sailors were involved in this naval battle. And this naval battle is called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Just after the defeat of Guadalcanal, the Japanese forces were in retreat. They were basically being pushed back towards Japan. With American forces island hopping, getting even closer to Japan, right? Eventually, they get to the Philippines. Now, those of you, I'll pull up a map in a few moments. The Philippines are, not close to Japan, but they are close enough where you could, in theory, launch a couple of airplanes and fly to Japan and still have enough fuel to go back. So Japan really does not want the United States to have the Philippines. It's also basically the best protection for Australia. Remember, the Japanese are also kind of trying to get into Australia. And so Australian forces are actually going to join American forces in this giant naval battle where Japan is going to send what's left of its fleet, what's left of its navy, and in one final push, try to stop the American Navy. You guys know we're not speaking Japanese, right? We're not speaking German. You know what happens. The outcome is the United States wins a definitive battle. This basically destroys most of the Japanese Navy. So Japan's very limited now in what ships it can send out into the Pacific. If you were to ask me as a historian, like someone who's looked at history, for me, this is the point where the U.S. basically wins World War II in the Pacific, because after this battle, after the United States takes the Philippines and effectively destroys the Japanese Navy, it's really only a matter of time before Japan is basically forced to either surrender because they're surrounded, or it becomes a battle of attrition where just so many Japanese soldiers end up being killed that they basically have to surrender. But the Japanese do not surrender, even though that may have been the wise thing to do. Maybe that would have saved millions of lives. They don't. They don't surrender, and part of that is because part of this military culture that they had in Japan frowned upon surrender. They basically saw surrender as something despicable, as something only the weak did, right? And so you see cases of Japanese soldiers fighting on until the very, basically knowing that they're defeated, only fighting because they abhor, they're disdainful of surrender. And you hear like really crazy stories of like in the Philippines, right, where Japanese soldiers who were entrenched in the mountains refused to believe that Japan lost the war. And so they'll be out in the jungles of the Philippines for decades after World War II, hiding, basically thinking that hearing all these messages, hearing the news is all just a trap to try to get them to come out, when that wasn't the case. You also see this. You see the kamikaze. Kamikaze is a Japanese word. It means sacred wind. And it's basically a reference back to Japanese history, where multiple times in their history, they've been saved from their enemies when they would get really lucky and a typhoon, that's a hurricane in the Pacific, would hit and basically sink all of their enemies' ships. And so the kamikaze has this tradition in Japanese history. Now, that's not what these guys are, right? These guys are obviously not hurricanes. They are naming themselves after the sacred wind. They're saying, hey, look, we are now the wind. We are the typhoons that will sink our enemies' ships. And these kamikaze, those of you who are not familiar, are basically suicide pilots. These are men who would rather crash their airplane into American ships than watch Japan surrender. They would rather do that than give up World War II. This kills a lot of Americans. If you take the sum total of kamikaze pilots and the destruction that they did, they killed as many Americans. Like their effort was as destructive as Pearl Harbor, right? So they really took. I mean, it was not. They were feared. I mean, Americans were afraid of the kamikaze. Because how do you stop them, right? Like their whole goal is to die. Their whole goal is to just fly their airplane into your ship. Let's watch some footage, right? And the great thing about the terrible thing about World War II, depending on how you see it, is there's a lot of footage. There is a lot of video, a lot of primary sources on the Second World War. So let's take a look at the toll of the kamikaze in the Pacific.
April 6th dawns quiet in the waters off Okinawa. The calm did not comfort Ensign Doug Aitken.
We knew that we were going to be in for trouble. We just knew it.
On the nearby islands, the Japanese had been gathering every usable plane and pilot remaining in their arsenal. Some are inexperienced, but no less devoted. They call this mission Kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum. They take off in waves. They begin a kamikaze spree that dwarfs anything before or since. In the next 2 days, over 350 enemy planes wreak absolute havoc. American pilots try to stop them in roller coaster dogfights. Navy gunners try to derail them in white-knuckle, high-speed combat, sometimes close enough to see each other's faces. General Buckner, an avid hunter, describes the adrenaline rush to his wife.
I have had thrills in duck blinds, but none comparable to that of seeing an enemy plane shot down when it was heading directly at our ship.
Some are cut down. Others get through. For sailors like Doug Aitken, the horror is burned into memory.
And all of a sudden, general quarters, all hands, man your battle stations. First of all, power went out. So we opened the doors and we could see all this commotion and all this smoke.
Japan intentionally crashes 1,900 planes and suicide dives around Okinawa, the most intense kamikaze attacks of the entire Pacific campaign. They sink 26 ships and damage 164 more. The Japanese consider it noble sacrifice. The Americans consider it inhumane warfare.
You can't identify people. The right thing to do is bury at sea.
It is the greatest concentration of Navy losses since Pearl Harbor.
All right, so there's a reason also, just keep in mind, there's a reason why I'm kind of opening with this, because this is going to be relevant in the second section, right, of today's lesson. I'm kind of leaning into like, look, the Americans were terrified of the Japanese, even though we're functionally winning, right? Even though it's even almost inevitable that the U.S. is going to win in the Pacific. It's not an easy battle. It's not an easy war for the United States, nor is it for the Japanese. So let's see what's going on with my presentation here. Let's get out of, let's go full screen mode again. All right, I think I'll have to refresh the presentation. Give a few seconds. I'll stop recording for. Okay, I think we're good. I'm not going to play any more of the videos because my computer's decided that it doesn't want to participate. Whatever. All right, so kamikaze, destructive to a lot of Americans. Most destructive since Pearl Harbor, actually. So just keep that in mind. That's in Americans' minds at the end, as World War II is winding down in the Pacific. Second thing is this island hopping thing, super difficult. Two big battles come out. Iwo Jima, you guys know this picture, right? Like this is one of the most famous images of World War II, if not the most famous image. This is a battle of Iwo Jima. It's 750 miles away from Tokyo. It becomes extremely fierce. The battle is extremely fierce. The Japanese, even though this is just an island that's 700 miles away from Japan, there's nothing there. There's maybe an airstrip. They do not surrender Iwo Jima easily. In fact, some of the men in this photo, even as we're declaring victory, putting that flag on top of what's called Mount Suraibachi, on top of Iwo Jima, some of these men don't even survive the Battle of Iwo Jima. Some of these men actually passed away in the fighting after this photo was taken a few days later. So the Americans are seeing that. Second big battle that stands out is the Battle of Okinawa. That's 300 miles away from what we would normally think of as Japan. Okinawa is technically a part of Japan, but it's it's way out there. It's again 300 miles south of some of the main islands of Japan. The Japanese forces put up an extremely desperate fight to keep Americans out. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers are killed in this fighting, while 12,000 American soldiers were killed. Now, only 300 miles away, the United States is functionally at Japan's door. They are at their doorstep. But people back off. America slows down, and they ask this really difficult question. How destructive is an invasion of Japan going to be? Before we move on, though, let's do our quick check for understanding. 3 questions. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history and resulted in the nearly complete destruction of the Japanese fleet. Number 2, kamikaze pilots flew suicide missions, crashing their planes into American ships. And 3, the Japanese surrendered quickly and easily at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. All right, let's move into the last 2 sections of today's lesson launch, the atomic bomb and the Japanese surrender. A little bit of background information. Now, if you go back all the way to the start of World War II, before the Nazis were defeated, there were some Nazi scientists who were attempting to build a new type of weapon, a new type of bomb that would get its power by ripping apart atoms. Because when you rip apart an atom, when you basically destroy matter, you get a lot of energy out of that. So the resulting explosion that you would get from splitting atoms would basically form the most powerful weapon ever devised by humans. Can you imagine if the Nazis acquired the most powerful weapon ever? Some of the world's top scientists, including Albert Einstein, write a letter to President Roosevelt, urging him to also research this atomic bomb, saying, hey, we have to beat the Nazis to this bomb, because if the Nazis get this technology, it's over, we're done. And so, of course, President Roosevelt says, all right, we need to get on it. He starts a secret project called the Manhattan Project, which was basically taking some of America's top scientists, sending them to New Mexico and having them develop this new type of weapon that we call an atomic bomb. So just keep that in mind. Nazi Germany eventually defeated. July 16th, 1945, the first atomic bomb is successfully detonated in the desert of New Mexico. Now, this is July 1965. The Nazis, the Germans, already surrendered a month earlier. Japan, however, is still technically at war against the United States. So, a question comes up, or two big questions come up. One, there's a rumor going around. No one knows where this number comes from, but it was a rumor. It's what was going around. It's what the president of the United States at the time would have heard. It's what the leadership in the Pentagon, that's the center of the American military, this is what they would have heard. They were hearing that 1 million American lives could be lost in the direct invasion of Japan. Never mind how many Japanese people would be killed, but 1 million Americans could die. Now, whether or not that's true, we don't know. We certainly didn't find out, but that's certainly the rumor going around. There's another plan, right? And the other strategy was maybe we can blockade Japan. Maybe we can surround Japan. A lot of Japanese people would die that way, but maybe maybe we can basically starve Japan into surrender. But then there's another fear. This one's more of a fear, perhaps justified, and that the Soviet Union was trying to increase their influence in Asia. The Soviet Union, as we're going to see in the next lesson, maybe you saw some of that in the last lesson even, not really getting along with the United States, not really, we're technically allied against the Nazis, but after World War II, I don't know, some Americans are starting to think, we need to keep an eye on the Soviet Union. Now, President Truman, because Roosevelt had passed away a few months earlier, now we have a new president, President Truman, was informed about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb soon after Roosevelt died. It was so top secret that even the vice president of the United States did not know about this until he became president. Now, he is seeing this. It is being suggested to him that the bombs, this weapon that we have, could be used to force Japan into a quick surrender, saving both American lives in the process and even Japanese lives, right? If you could make Japan, force them to have a quick surrender, it will save some Japanese lives. This is the version popular in American histories. there's a version popular in Japanese histories, which then would say, or in Japanese textbooks, and they say, well, okay, no, Japan was inevitable. We were going to surrender anyways. The dropping of the atomic bombs was because Japan, or the United States, dropped the atomic bombs on Japan as a way to scare the Soviet Union. They were basically using Japan as a way, they were killing the people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a way to intimidate the Soviet Union. Which version is true? That will be the topic of a future lesson where you'll do your own investigation. You will look at the sources. You will look at the evidence presented, and you will make an argument specifically about how we should think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima, the United States basically has two bombs, and they intend to use them both. On August 6, 1945, the United States drops the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion comes from 3 airplanes, or the bomb is dropped from a fleet of 3 airplanes, who then circle around. And as they're circling around, they take video footage of the atomic bomb exploding over Hiroshima. The explosion is so hot near the center. If you were within a couple of 100 meters of the initial explosion, you were essentially torn apart into your atomic compositions. People were basically turned into dust nearby. Some people were killed by the shockwave, knocking buildings down. And a larger amount of people would end up dying after from the complications of radiation poisoning. August 9th, according to the narrative from decades ago, the Japanese didn't believe that Hiroshima was destroyed. And so the United States went and dropped a second atomic bomb. Now, why do historians question that today? Well, Nagasaki is even further away from the capital of Japan, in Tokyo. It really, I don't know. You'll have your own opinion after looking at the primary sources after. I don't want to influence you, but just know the U.S. drops these 2 bombs and immediately kills about 226,000 Japanese, mostly civilians, non-combatants. And of course, we don't know how many people died in the long term due to the complications of radiation poisoning, which would include some types of cancer. Eventually, though, about a month later, the emperor, or over the course of the month, the emperor meets with his advisors, and they agree to surrender to the United States terms. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan formally surrenders to the United States. This is known as Victory Japan Day. And this is it. This wraps up World War II, the single most destructive conflict in human history. Nothing else killed more people, destroyed more lives, destroyed more cities than did the Second World War. And it is now finally over. But now the world is going to be tasked with rebuilding. And we have a new conflict fermenting, right? I mentioned the Soviet Union. That's going to be something that's going to dominate what happens in the rest of the world after World War II. I'll go ahead and put those videos up on the Actively Learn article. I don't want to risk jamming up the presentation again. But if you're curious, some of that footage is extremely fascinating, especially the footage of the very end of World War II, the footage of the Japanese surrender. I get chills watching that, right? Because again, that is the moment that the single most destructive event in human history finally comes to an end. Anyways, so let's move into our last check for understanding. Number 4, the top secret plan to develop an atomic bomb or before Nazi scientists did was called the Manhattan Project. Number 5, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs in Japan, 1 in Hiroshima, another in Nagasaki. And 6, Japan formally surrendered on September 6, 1945. And that wraps it up for us. Just for closing, again, the usual, move on to the chapter reading after this, where the exit ticket is embedded at the end. And if you have any questions or need help, my office hours are listed here, 3:15, always on Tuesdays and Fridays, Wednesdays at 2. And of course, you can always email me if you don't want to come into office hours. You have my email address here. But until then, until I see some of you at office hours, take care, stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we'll get to have class in person soon.